Hello, I'm Hannah, and this is Hannah's Books. As the month of June flies by and we get close to the midpoint of the year, I've been thinking a lot about what I've read so far, how it's differed a bit from my previous reading, and what I want to read going forward. And then the stars aligned, and Alex at the great channel WhatPageAreYouOn tagged me for the mid-year book Freakout tag, a tag I did not really know about before. Yes, it is everywhere, but I only joined BookTube last fall, and while I watched a fair bit of BookTube for the couple of preceding years, I skipped over anything with the word freakout. In general, I wasn't interested in why people might be freaking out about their reading. But I'll watch absolutely anything that Alex puts out on his channel, so I turned on the video, only to realize that this tag gives people a chance to revel in whatever we've read so far, and perhaps consider what might be lying ahead for us in the next few months. This seems like a wonderful time to answer these prompts. And ever since I watched his video, a number of other booktubers who I watch regularly have also done wonderful versions. I do want to call your attention to one by a relatively large booktuber I just stumbled across. Noria at Noria Reads and I don't have much overlap in our reading tastes, it seems, and her answers to this tag's prompts were mostly books and even authors I'd not only not read, but not even heard of. But she is so clever and energetic and funny that I want to pass her link along down in the description box. If you are a cat person, you might especially enjoy her videos. So, on to the questions. First, what is the best book you've read so far in 2020? I've really enjoyed most of my reading this year, but a few books have really distinguished themselves for me. My favorite work of fiction this year, and my favorite work of fiction for the second half of the 20th century, at least, is Toni Morrison's Beloved. I first read it when it was first published, and I've reread it several times, most recently this past week. It's still just as breathtaking as it was the first time. In fact, the better I get to know the book, the more I can start to see what it is Morrison is doing in her writing. Yes, all of the Morrison I've read so far is incredible, but this particular one, I'll be making a full video about it at the end of the month for part of the Toni Morrison 2020 series. My favorite nonfiction book of my reading year so far is All the Lives We Ever Lived, Seeking Solace in Virginia Woolf, the 2019 memoir/biography/literary analysis written by Katherine Smyth. Alex at WhatPageAreYouOn listed this book on his video too, in response to a different prompt. Smyth works through her grief over the death of her father and her memories of him by working through Wolves to the Lighthouse, a book that became a beacon for her. Since I read her book, I've been fascinated with what for me is a new subgenre, the nerdy hybrid of intimate memoir and academic or sort of academic study. I'll try to put together a discussion on that kind of book by the end of the year. I've read several so far and have a couple of additional volumes on my longer-term TBR. Mostly, though, Smyth's book feels so resonant or recognizable because she makes it clear how much both reading and writing shape how she understands and experiences the world. The second prompt is, what has been your favorite sequel in the first half of this year? I've not read any sequels so far this year, I don't think. I don't tend to read series of books in general, but I do have a couple of sequels on my long-term TBR. This year, I finally read Marilynne Robinson's beautiful and quiet Gilead. Her book Housekeeping has been a serious favorite of mine for many years, but for whatever reason, I had not picked up this novel yet. Early in the year, I reread Housekeeping, and for maybe Midrash, I read Gilead, and of course loved it, especially its complicated exploration of what parenthood, fatherhood, means, especially in the face of death and dying. I'm very much looking forward to the sequels to Gilead, starting with Home, but including Lila, and the forthcoming Jack. In general, sequels are books that take a story forward in time, and prequels are books that tell a backstory. Home, though, is a book that occurs at the same time that Gilead occurs, kind of telling the story from another angle. The other sequels I'm eager to read answer the next prompt, one that asks us to consider what new releases we haven't read yet, but want to read. Early this year, I read Hilary Mantel's Wolf Hall for the first time. I loved it as I was reading, but to be honest, the events of the year so far have made me feel awfully disconnected to the book at this point. I think I may need to reread it before I start the two sequels. The second sequel, that is, the third in the trilogy, is of course The Mirror and the Light, a book that came out this year and has gotten phenomenal reviews in the press as well as by many of you here on BookTube. And it's probably the new release I am most excited about reading. Another new release I need to read is the second book of Olive Kitteridge by Elizabeth Strout. But again, I have to read the first book as well. My husband David really enjoyed these books, and I will get to them at some point. On to the next question. What is your most anticipated release for the second half of the year? I'm eager to read Rachel Cohen's book, Austen Years, a memoir in 5 novels. In many ways like the book All the Lives We Ever Lived, Austen Years is a memoir/literary study about how the author used literature to explore her own grief, as well as all the joy happening in her life at the same moment. The book will supposedly come out here in the States on July 21st, just in time to slip it in for Jane Austen July. I really hope my pre-order will arrive in time. The next prompt asks us to consider our biggest disappointment of 2020 so far. Sadly, it was my reread of Mama Day by Gloria and Naylor. I absolutely loved it, as did my still soon-to-be spouse David back in the early 1990s. For all these years, I've thought of it as one of the all-time greats I had read in my life. Perhaps I had just put it on too high a pedestal and expected too much from it. Or perhaps it's a book that works better for younger people, and I'm just too old and stodgy now. Or maybe it's just a bit too dated itself now, which is at least part of the story, I think. Whatever the reason for my disappointment, I have to say I was just heartbroken by having to reshape my take on the book. There have certainly been books I liked less on the second reading or more on the second reading, but I've never had this big a change in my feelings about a book. So I was disappointed in the book, but even sadder to have this sort of dramatic breakup with an old love. On to more positive news. What have been your biggest reading surprises this year? This question might be prompting us to talk about a book that surprised us, but I'm going to talk about a couple of surprises in my reading life and bookish world. First, I've been quite surprised that I've read as much nonfiction as I have this year. I've always read a lot of nonfiction, including a lot of academic history that I don't especially want to talk about here on this channel in general. But I would have thought that in a time of both pandemic and global protests against racial injustice, I might have sought solace, sought escape in novels. But no, especially at the beginning of the Great Isolation, I read almost exclusively nonfiction. And wildly, I also seem to have found a love for audiobooks. I've always loved reading aloud with my family, and I've always loved listening to audiobooks on long drives with that family. But I've never really gotten on that well listening to audio when doing chores or going for walks or right before bed. Although I certainly listened to a bunch, I often found myself having a far less positive response to books on audio than I did to books I had read in real life, read in print. Jane Eyre has been my favorite book since I was 12 or 13, I think, and I've read it dozens of times probably. But when I listened to the audio, I might have given it 4 stars. But this year, I seem to have made a breakthrough. I've definitely been loving audiobooks lately, and I think that trying some nonfiction on audio might have been the thing that helped me past my basic limitations on that front. Another happy reading surprise. I've been amazed by how much my spouse David has read this year and how seriously he's read. For as long as we've been together, he's enjoyed books, but in general, as a very busy person with a lot going on in his head, he's steered clear of especially difficult books and especially long books. But he's now utterly fearless, reading Mantel's Wolf Hall, Salman Rushdie's Midnight's Children, The Overstory by Richard Powers, etc. What fun to watch this development. Incidentally, I haven't read either of those last two books, and both of them really need to go on my list. Perhaps I can get David to come talk books with me again soon. I really loved having him on for the Books with Friends tag, which I'll link to below in the description box. Question 7. Do you have a favorite new author? Either the author of a debut or an author who's new to you. Well, I found several, actually. I mentioned that my favorite nonfiction book of the year was All the Lives We Ever Lived, and I'm certainly looking forward to seeing what she writes next. Her book is such a great mix of genres, of biography and literary criticism, but also a very personal memoir that I can imagine her future work might include a novel. Smyth definitely has the soul of a novelist. A slightly more academic book, but one with an enormously strong narrative voice and a wonderful sense of characterization, is the book I just finished, The Equivalents, A Story of Art, Female Friendship, and Liberation in the 1960s by Maggie Doherty. A discussion of a group of women who hope their new fellowships at the Radcliffe Institute for Independent Study will give them the rooms of their own that Virginia Woolf calls for, and who find, as Doherty says, their own Bloomsbury. I'll talk about it more fully very soon, possibly Friday. I suspect that Doherty will write more history or biography, which I'll be lining up to purchase, but if she tries her hand at fiction, I'd absolutely pick that up as well. Okay, prompt number 8. Who is your new fictional crush? Gracious, I'm too old for crushes, but I will choose one, a person from a book who is not fictional, but is definitely a well-drawn character. That is Rose Pastor Stokes from this year's Rebel Cinderella, From Rags to Riches to Radical, by the acclaimed author Adam Hochschild. Stokes was a Jewish refugee to the U.S. in the early part of the 20th century, who, through a series of historically very important events, met and then married a very wealthy man. Yeah, she became Cinderella to a lot of Americans who read about her in the papers, but she also becomes a fierce and feisty radical activist, one who will not step back from her platform just to make men happy, or rich people happy, or the government happy. And, not surprisingly, Stokes does in fact make them very unhappy. I guess that she's my crush. I should refer to her not as Stokes, but as Rose. The next question asks us for our new favorite character. I spent a while wondering what the difference is between a literary crush and a favorite character. And of course, since I'm an old married person, I talked it over with my spouse. He helped me work out that often our crushes are on people we see as different and exciting. Our favorite characters are, on the other hand, often, but not always, people we see at least partially as mirrors of our own selves, or mirrors of the people we want to be or become. Just like with the last question, I'm going to choose a character who is not fictional. Recently, I read 2 very short memoirs by Annie Ernaux, and Ernaux is my favorite character, or at least her version of herself who narrates both a man's place and a woman's story. Both are these gorgeous little pieces where she both works through her own history and her own grief, but also tries to really see the deep stories of her parents' lives, to understand them far more deeply than she had before. While certainly I am not able to do what Ernaux does, not just the writing but the thinking, her skill at the incredibly honest and yet deeply generous way she thinks about people she loves is a skill I want more than any other skill. Incidentally, yet another nod towards Alex at What Page Are You On? Annie Ernaux is an author I had not read until his videos introduced me to her. I still have almost all of her work in front of me. Question 10. What is a book that made you cry? I cry at pretty much every book, honestly. Until I saw a few of these videos recently, I thought that all readers must do that, but apparently not. Usually I just tear up a bit or feel that lump in my throat. But I remember some serious weeping in Mark Doty's new memoir cum literary analysis, What is the Grass? Walt Whitman in My Life, just because I so wanted to be able to get to know Walt Whitman in real life. That sounds ridiculous, but if you've read the book, I think you might get what I mean. And I cried hard in Eve Ewing's beautiful series of poems called 1919 about the anti-Black race riots in Chicago during that year, partly because the poems were so beautiful, and partly because the subject matter was so heartbreaking and angering. I absolutely bawled during Lighthouse Keeping by Jeanette Winterson, even though I don't think the book was Winterson's best work by any means, nor that the story was all that sad. But I guess I read the novel at a moment when themes of isolation were already playing through my head. So yeah, I'll cry at anything. On to question 11. What's a book that made you happy? In his take on this tag, Alex used All the Lives We Ever Lived here, the memoir I keep mentioning that is also a book about Virginia Woolf and her novel. The book made me happy too, and made me cry as well, and I listed it before for my favorite nonfiction of the year. However, here I'm going to choose a related book, Mitts, The Marmoset of Bloomsbury by Sigrid Nunez, about a special pet who lived with Leonard and Virginia Woolf. I listened to the book Mitts on audio, one of the first audiobooks that really worked for me when I was listening by myself. I listened to most of it as I walked around town, to a visit with my physical therapist to work on a knee injury, to a grocery store for supplies. Yes, it was the day before I started lockdown, and certain supplies were very hard to come by. My son and his girlfriend were arriving a couple of days later, and I didn't want to have to share the one roll we had left between our two bathrooms. Anyway, since they arrived, the four of us have only left our house and the quiet streets of our neighborhood a handful of times to do an occasional grocery shopping in person, or for the kids to visit the wine store to acquire champagne right after they turn 21. We've been perhaps especially careful due to some family risk factors. Mitts, The Marmoset of Bloomsbury, this book about the wholeness of daily life, things that often occur in the most quotidian and undramatic of family settings, has stayed with me and made me appreciate the small world around me a bit more. The book has lasted in a way I'm not sure it would have if I'd read it at a less transformative moment. The 12th prompt asks us to talk about the most beautiful book we bought or received. I recently acquired a newly published edition of The Autobiography of Alice B. Toklas, written by Gertrude Stein and lavishly illustrated by Maura Kalman. Although I've not yet read this edition, I've pored over some of the beautiful paintings, many of which remind me of the work of Matisse. And finally, the last prompt, what are the books you feel you have to read by the end of the year? I love Alex's answer that there is no book that we have to read by the end of the year. If I learned anything in my past few reading months, and honestly my past few reading years, it's that my reading plans will absolutely change based on what's happening in my own personal life, my family's lives, what's going on in the nation and the world, what my emotions are, and what I can pay attention to. As I've said, I've read a higher percentage of nonfiction this year, and I've certainly successfully listened to more audiobooks. I've read more about pandemics, from the Black Death to the 1918 flu, than I had planned for 2020. And although I always read both nonfiction and fiction by Black authors and about Black experiences, I've read far more this spring than usual, and especially more about anti-Black violence. Who knows what events are coming around the corner for the rest of the year? My bookshelf will be ready if I want to make changes. But for now, I'm imagining a lot of Jane Austen in July, plus some of Boswell's Johnson, a lot of BookTube Prize judging for the final round in August, Shakespeare in September, Victorian literature in October, Victober, as it will always be for me thanks to BookTube, nonfiction in November, etc. Can I fit in some Proust? My son's girlfriend, who's living with us during the plague, says she's willing to be my reading partner for some of the books, and willing to help me try baking some madeleines, too. There's always enough to keep my head full of stories and my nightstand full of books. All that's left is to tag someone. And I'll tag Jack at Rambling Raconteur. If I'm remembering correctly, I think I tagged him fairly recently, only to see that he posted his video moments before I posted mine. Let's see if I can pull that off again. I'll also tag Courtney Ferriter, America's Jewish mother, who already made a great video reviewing some of her favorite and least favorite reads of the year so far. This tag is a little different, so if you're interested in treading over a little adjacent ground, I'd love to hear from you. Thanks again, Alex, for tagging me, and thanks to all of you for joining me today here on Hannah's Books. See you soon.